Bevor wir beginnen, lass mich dir eine Frage stellen. Welche Epoche der Geschichte Marokkos findest du am spannendsten? Die Antike, die Zeit der großen islamischen Reiche oder die moderne Gegenwart? Schreib deine Antwort unten in die Kommentare. Ich bin sehr gespannt auf deine Meinung. Denn Marokko ist weit mehr als ein Land auf der Landkarte. Es ist ein Ort, an dem sich seit Jahrtausenden Kulturen begegnen, Reiche aufstiegen und wieder verschwanden, und an dem Geschichte nicht nur erzählt, sondern gelebt wurde. Zwischen Atlantik und Sahara, zwischen Mittelmeer und Atlasgebirge entstand ein Raum, der Afrika, Europa und den Nahen Osten miteinander verband. Durch Handel, Glauben, Wissen und Macht. In diesem Video nehmen wir dich mit auf eine Reise durch genau diese Geschichte. Von den ersten Menschen und den Amazigh über römische Städte, mächtige Dynastien und koloniale Umbrüche bis hin zum modernen Marokko von heute. Eine Geschichte voller Wendepunkte, Konflikte und kultureller Blüte, die bis heute nachwirkt. Wenn du Lust hast, Geschichte nicht nur als Daten und Namen zu sehen, sondern als lebendige Erzählung, dann unterstütze dieses Video mit einem Like und abonniere den Kanal, damit du kein weiteres Kapitel verpasst. Jetzt aber lass uns gemeinsam eintauchen. An den Anfang einer der faszinierendsten Geschichten Nordafrikas.
Chapter 1. The Land Between Sea and Desert. Morocco is located in a place where worlds meet. Just a glance at the map shows why this area has played a special role in history for thousands of years. In the north, only the narrow Mediterranean separates Europe from Africa. In the west, the Atlantic opens up to the rest of the world. In the south, the endless expanse of the Sahara begins, and in the interior of the country mighty mountains rise. Hardly any other region in North Africa combines so many different landscapes in a comparatively small area, and hardly any other place was so predestined to become a hub of trade, cultures, and power. Morocco is not a homogeneous country, but a geographical mosaic. Each of these natural spaces shaped in its own way the history, ways of life, and political structures of the people who lived here. If you want to understand Morocco's past, you first have to understand its country, because here nature has always determined the course of history. In the north, Morocco is bordered by the Mediterranean Sea. This coast was an early gateway to the ancient world. Traders, seafarers, and conquerors from the eastern Mediterranean reached North Africa via this route. At the same time, the Mediterranean was a border. It connected Morocco to Europe, but also separated it. For centuries, the proximity to Al-Andalus made the north of the country a cultural and political transition area between the Islamic and Christian worlds. Even more important for the long-term development, however, was the Atlantic coast in the west. The Atlantic made Morocco an open country, open to trade, discovery, and later also to the colonial ambitions of European powers. Long before modern ports emerged, coastal peoples used this sea route for fishing, exchange, and long-distance trade. In the early modern period, the Atlantic Ocean finally became the key to Morocco's integration into global trade networks that reached as far as America. Between these two seas rises the backbone of the country, the Atlas Mountains. The Atlas is not a single mountain range, but a complex system of high and low mountain ranges that runs through Morocco from southwest to northeast. These mountains looked like a natural fortress. They protected regions from external influences, separated population groups from each other, and favored the emergence of independent cultures. At the same time, however, they were also a challenge: rugged, difficult to pass, and climatically extreme. The Atlas Mountains were never just a border, but also a habitat. In its valleys, villages, trade routes, and agricultural oases were created. The mountains provided water, wood, and shelter, and they offered retreats in times of political unrest. Again and again, they played a decisive role when dynasties rose or fell, because whoever controlled the Atlas controlled the heart of the country. South of the Atlas, a completely different world begins: the Sahara. For many, it seems like the end of the habitable world, but historically it was the opposite. The Sahara was not an empty barrier, but a space of movement. Caravans crossed the desert and connected Morocco with West Africa. Gold, salt, ivory, and knowledge traveled north via these routes, while fabrics, weapons, and ideas made their way south. The desert made Morocco a link between the Mediterranean and sub-Saharan Africa. This location between the sea and the desert gave Morocco a unique strategic importance. The country was a transit area, interface, and meeting place, and that is precisely why it was always fought over. Those who controlled Morocco had access to trade routes, raw materials, and cultural influence. This geographical reality explains why so many empires have left their mark here throughout history. The climate reinforced this diversity even further. While the Atlantic coast has a comparatively mild, humid climate, inland summers can be extremely hot and winters in the mountains can be surprisingly cold. Snow-capped peaks in the Atlas are in stark contrast to the glowing dunes of the Sahara. These climatic contrasts forced people to adapt and promoted inventiveness, cooperation, and regional specialization. Agriculture was only possible where water was available. Rivers, seasonal rainfall, and sophisticated irrigation systems decided on prosperity or hardship. Early settlements emerged in fertile plains, while dry regions favored nomadic ways of life. This mixture of sedentary life and nomadism shaped the social structure of Morocco until modern times. The geographical diversity also had an impact on the political organization. Centralized rule was difficult because distances were great and landscapes inaccessible. Many regions retained their independence for a long time, even under powerful dynasties. Local leaders, tribal structures, and religious authorities played as important a role as kings and caliphs. The country itself resisted simple power structures. It was precisely this fragmentation that made Morocco resilient. In times of external threat, people could retreat to mountains or deserts. Foreign powers had a hard time controlling the entire area permanently. Nature thus became an ally of the population, a factor that was to be repeated in many epochs of history. But Morocco has never been isolated. Its location virtually forced it to interact with the outside world. Ideas, religions, and technologies entered the country by land and sea. At the same time, Morocco exported its own cultural influences far beyond its borders. This constant movement made the country a dynamic space of exchange, but also of conflict. Morocco was perceived as a transition zone early on, neither quite African in the classical sense nor completely Mediterranean or Oriental. This intermediate position formed its own identity. She explains why Moroccan culture carries so many influences and yet remains something independent. Geography was never just a backdrop, but an active co-creator of history. When we look at Morocco today, we see a country whose landscapes still exude the same power as they did thousands of years ago. The mountains, the seas, and the desert are not only places, but carriers of memory. They tell of migration and sedentariness, of wealth and deprivation, of openness and withdrawal. This interplay of nature and man laid the foundation for everything that was to follow. Before empires emerged, before religions came and dynasties arose, there was first the country itself, forming, demanding, and unifying at the same time. And that's exactly why Morocco's history doesn't begin with kings or battles, but with a space that has attracted, shaped, and challenged people for thousands of years. In the next chapter, we will turn to those people who first inhabited this land, and whose legacy is still felt today. Chapter 2: The First Humans and the Amazigh. Long before there were empires, cities, or written history, people already lived in the territory of today's Morocco. Their traces go back hundreds of thousands of years and tell of adaptation, survival, and a deep connection between humans and landscape. At a time when Africa's climate was very different from today, this country provided favorable conditions for early human communities. Rivers carried water, savannas alternated with forests, and the Sahara was not yet a sea of sand, but a habitable region. Archaeological finds show that Morocco is one of the most important regions of early African history. Stone tools have been discovered in caves and open settlement sites, which are among the oldest of their kind. These early humans lived as hunter-gatherers, following the seasons and taking advantage of what nature offered them. Their existence was closely linked to the climate and the environment, and it was precisely this dependence that shaped their way of life. With the gradual change in the climate, people's lives also changed. As the Sahara increasingly dried up, large parts of North Africa became uninhabitable. Entire population groups had to look for new habitats. Many moved north, towards the more fertile coastal regions and the Atlas Mountains. These migratory movements were not sudden flights, but slow processes over generations. They laid the foundations for the cultures that later developed in Morocco. From this long early history emerged those people who are considered the indigenous people of North Africa, the Amazigh. The name Amazigh translates as free person, a term that already reveals a lot about their self-image. The Amazigh were not a unified people in the modern sense, but a multitude of tribes and communities connected by language, cultural practices, and a common ancestry. The culture of the Amazigh developed in close dialogue with the landscape. In the mountains, desert edges, and fertile plains, different life forms emerged. Some groups lived sedentary and farmed, others moved through the country as nomads with their herds. This diversity was not a weakness, but a strength. It made the Amazigh societies adaptable and resilient to environmental changes and external influences. One of the most impressive testimonies of the early Amazigh culture are the rock carvings and engravings that extend over large parts of Morocco and the Sahara. They show animals such as giraffes, elephants, and cattle, species that have long since disappeared from these regions. These depictions are silent witnesses of a bygone world and prove how much the climate and environment have changed. At the same time, they provide insight into the symbolic world of the people who created them. The rock art was more than mere decoration. It probably had ritual, social, or spiritual significance. Scenes of hunting, dancing, or gatherings indicate complex community structures. The images told stories, conveyed knowledge, and created identity, long before writing existed. In an oral culture, such visual signs were of central importance. Over time, the Amazigh developed their own social orders. Tribal structures regulated coexistence, property, and conflicts. Decisions were often made collectively, and authority was based less on absolute power than on recognition and tradition. This form of organization allowed the Amazigh to react flexibly to changes and maintain their independence. The Amazigh also skillfully adapted to their environment economically. They farmed where possible, bred animals, and used trade routes to exchange goods. The exchange between mountain regions, coastal areas, and the south was particularly important. This is how early networks were created that connected Morocco with other parts of Africa as early as prehistoric times. Spiritually, the early Amazigh societies were strongly connected to nature. Mountains, springs, and special landscapes were considered sacred. These ideas shaped rituals and customs, and sometimes even survived later religious upheavals. Even today, traces of these old beliefs can be seen in Moroccan traditions, a sign of their deep roots. The language played a central role in the preservation of Amazighian identity. For generations, knowledge, history, and values have been passed on orally. Songs, poems, and stories kept memories alive. Even without writing, the Amazigh developed a strong cultural memory that carried them through times of change. Later, when foreign powers and cultures came to North Africa, they did not encounter an empty country, but societies with a long history and a consolidated identity. The Amazigh were not passive recipients of external influences. They absorbed new things, adapted them, and combined them with their own traditions. This process was to be repeated again and again throughout Moroccan history. The early history and culture of the Amazigh show that Morocco's identity did not begin with states or religions. It is more deeply rooted in a millennia-old relationship between man and landscape, between community and freedom. The Amazigh laid the cultural foundation on which all later epochs were built. This heritage is still visible today, in language, music, symbols, and ways of life. It is a reminder that Morocco's history is not just a succession of dynasties, but a long human narrative that began in early times and continues to the present day. In the next chapter, new actors enter the stage of the story, sailors and traders from the Mediterranean region who were supposed to connect Morocco with the ancient world. Chapter 3: Phoenicians and Carthaginians. Morocco becomes part of the ancient world. When the great seafaring cultures of the Mediterranean began to spread in the first millennium BC, the territory of today's Morocco increasingly became the focus of a world that was connected by trade and sea routes. What had previously been primarily a space of regional cultures now became part of an extensive network that stretched from the eastern Mediterranean to the Atlantic coast. With the Phoenicians and later the Carthaginians, a new era began for Morocco, the integration into the ancient world. The Phoenicians came from the area of present-day Lebanon. They were not conquerors in the classical sense, but traders and seafarers. Their wealth was based on shipbuilding, navigation, and the exchange of goods over long distances. In search of new markets and raw materials, they ventured further and further west. In doing so, they followed the coasts, established bases, and established trade relations with local populations. The North African Atlantic and Mediterranean coasts offered ideal conditions for such contacts. Natural harbors, navigable estuaries, and access to sought-after resources made Morocco attractive. Instead of building large cities, the Phoenicians established small trading posts. These served as intermediate stations, storage areas, and meeting points for the exchange of goods. One of the most important places of these early contacts was Lixus, near today's Atlantic coast. Archaeological finds indicate that Phoenician traders were active here very early on. Lixus developed into a hub where Mediterranean and local goods came together. Purple fabrics, ceramics, and metal goods were exchanged for raw materials from the hinterland. These contacts were not a one-way street. The local population, especially the Amazigh, contributed their own products and knowledge. Cattle, hides, metals, and possibly also gold from the south reached the Mediterranean region via these trade routes. At the same time, local communities adopted new techniques, tools, and cultural influences. Retail changed ways of life without completely displacing them. Over time, a Phoenician colony gained special importance, Carthage, in today's Tunisia. This city developed into a powerful trading empire that controlled large parts of the western Mediterranean. The Carthaginians were heirs to the Phoenician tradition, but politically and militarily much more organized. Their influence extended far beyond the coasts. For Morocco, the rise of Carthage meant an intensification of contacts. The region became part of a Carthaginian trade network that connected goods, people, and ideas. Coastal towns served as transshipment points, while caravans brought in new products from the interior. Metals, agricultural products, and exotic goods from the south were particularly valuable. This phase can be understood as an early form of globalization. Although the ancient world was small compared to today's standards, the interconnectedness was extraordinary for its time. Morocco was no longer a peripheral area, but part of a system that connected different continents. Decisions made in Carthage or other Mediterranean centers had a direct impact on the coasts of North Africa. The presence of the Carthaginians also led to changes in urban development. While early settlements were mostly small and functional, more complex structures now emerged. Warehouses, temples, and workshops shaped the image of the coastal towns. These places were cultural contact zones in which different languages, customs, and beliefs met. Religiously, the Phoenicians and Carthaginians brought their own gods with them. Cults and rituals found their way into the new settlements, often in a mixed form with local traditions. This religious diversity reflected the character of the trade, pragmatic, adaptable, and open to integration. Religion was not imposed, but lived from exchange. The power structure also changed politically. Local elites who profited from trade gained influence. Alliances between Carthaginian traders and Amazighan leaders were not uncommon. These cooperations were based on mutual benefit and contributed to the stability of trade relations. At the same time, the interior of the country remained largely independent of direct control by Carthage. Despite these close ties, Morocco was never fully Carthaginian. The influence was concentrated in the coastal regions, while the hinterland retained its own structures. This separation was to prove important when Carthage later came into conflict with a new power, Rome. The fall of Carthage in the 2nd century BC marked a profound turning point in the ancient world. For Morocco, it marked the end of an era, but not the end of its role as a trading area. The existing networks, cities and routes formed the basis for the next phase of the story. What the Phoenicians and Carthaginians had begun was to be continued by other powers. In retrospect, this epoch was decisive for Morocco's place in world history. For the first time, the country became part of a super-regional system that reached far beyond its own borders. Trade connected cultures, created wealth, and brought change. Morocco became a link between the Mediterranean and Africa, a role that it would retain in various forms to the present day. In the next chapter, this connection is further expanded when a new great power enters the scene and Morocco comes under Roman rule. Chapter 4. Under Roman rule, Mauretania Tingitana. When Roman power strengthened in the western Mediterranean, the political order of North Africa changed fundamentally. After the fall of Carthage, a power vacuum opened up, which Rome gradually filled. The territory of today's Morocco also came under the influence of the Roman Empire. This marked the beginning of a new era in which Morocco became not only a trading area, but also part of one of the largest empires of antiquity. At first, Rome exerted its influence indirectly. Local kings ruled on behalf of or under the protection of Rome. This form of control was pragmatic. It ensured stability without immediately tying up military resources. But over time, Roman interest in direct administration grew. Strategic considerations, economic potential, and the securing of the western border of the empire finally led to the official establishment of a Roman province. This province was called Mauretania Tingitana. It encompassed the northern part of present-day Morocco and was the westernmost province of the Roman Empire in Africa. Their importance lay less in their size than in their location. It controlled important coastal sections on the Mediterranean and Atlantic and formed a link between Europe and Africa. Roman rule brought about profound changes, especially in urban areas. The Romans were masters of urban planning, and their presence is still evident today in the ruins of Roman cities. The most famous of these places is Volubilis, a city in the fertile north of the country. Volubilis became an administrative and economic center of the province and exemplifies the Roman influence on the region. Roman cities followed a clear pattern. Streets crossed at right angles, public squares formed the center of urban life, and monumental buildings symbolized order and power. Temples, basilicas, thermal baths, and triumphal arches shaped the cityscape. This architecture was not only functional, but also ideological. It conveyed Rome's claim to permanence, civilization, and superiority. A decisive factor for the integration of the province was the Roman road network. Roads connected cities, military posts, and ports, allowing for rapid communication and troop movements. They were the backbone of Roman control. Through this infrastructure, Mauretania Tingitana became more closely connected to the rest of the empire, especially to the Iberian Peninsula. But Roman rule meant not only control, but also economic development. The province was agriculturally productive. Olive oil, grain, and wine were produced and exported on a large scale. These goods not only supplied local markets, but also reached Italy and other parts of the empire. Trade brought prosperity and changed social structures. With the economy came new ways of life. Roman clothing, eating habits, and forms of living found their way into the cities. Latin became the language of administration. Roman law determined contracts and property relations. For parts of the local elite, the possibility of social advancement within the empire opened up. Some received Roman citizenship and took an active part in political and economic life. Despite this Romanization, the province remained culturally diverse. The majority of the population continued to be Amazigh, who preserved their languages, traditions, and social structures. The Roman influence was mainly concentrated in urban centers and fertile regions. In the interior of the country and in areas that are difficult to access, control remained limited. Rome did not rule everywhere with equal strength. This tension between center and periphery was typical of Roman provinces, but was particularly evident in Mauretania Tingitana. Again and again there were riots and resistance. Rome reacted with a military presence, erecting border fortifications and camps. Nevertheless, the province was more of a border region than a fully integrated core area of the empire. The Roman period also brought religious changes. Roman gods were worshipped, temples were built, and rituals were introduced. At the same time, these cults often merged with local beliefs. This religious diversity reflected the pragmatic attitude of Rome, which rarely tried to completely suppress existing traditions. In the course of time, Christianity also reached the province. It remained a minority religion at first, but its presence shows how strongly Mauretania Tingitana was involved in the developments of the Mediterranean region. Ideas traveled as well as goods and people. Despite all the investments, the province remained a challenge for Rome. Their peripheral location, limited resources, and constant external pressure made permanent control difficult. As the Roman Empire came under increasing pressure in the west, it gradually withdrew from remote areas. Mauretania Tingitana was also abandoned. The departure of the Romans marked the end of a phase of direct European rule that had lasted several centuries. But the traces of this time did not disappear. Cities, roads, agricultural structures, and legal concepts continued to have an effect. Even as new powers entered the region, they built on what Rome had left behind. The Roman era was thus more than a foreign occupation. It closely linked Morocco to Europe, integrated it into a global empire, and left lasting cultural and material traces. At the same time, it showed the limits of external rule in a geographically and culturally diverse space. In the next chapter, the power structure will again change fundamentally. A new religion and a new language will shape North Africa and lead Morocco into a completely new historical phase. Chapter 5: The Entry of Islam and Arab Expansion. In the 7th century AD, a development began that was to fundamentally change North Africa and thus also the territory of today's Morocco. A new religion spread out of the Arabian Peninsula, which not only brought spiritual ideas with it, but also redefined political, social, and cultural orders. The arrival of Islam was not an isolated event, but a decades-long process that had a lasting impact on the face of Morocco. After the decline of Roman rule and the brief period of Vandal and Byzantine control, North Africa was politically fragmented. Local rulers, tribal structures, and regional elites determined the picture. This fragmentation made it easier for the Arab Islamic armies to penetrate the region. This expansion was driven by a new religious dynamic and the aspiration to create a community of believers that transcended ethnic and regional boundaries. The first Arab advances reached North Africa in the middle of the 7th century. Initially, they concentrated on the east of the region, but soon the west also came into focus. For the people of Morocco, this meant encountering a new power whose influence went far beyond military conquest. Islam brought with it a worldview that restructured daily life, the legal system, and the social order. However, the advance of the Arabs was by no means smooth. The Amazigh in particular resisted the new rule. For them, it was not only about political independence, but also about preserving their way of life. In many regions, conflicts, uprisings, and changing alliances occurred. Arab expansion was therefore less a rapid triumph than a complex process of confrontation and adaptation. Crucial to the long-term success of Islam in Morocco was that it was not only spread by the sword. Many Amazigh embraced the new faith out of conviction because it promised social justice, community, and spiritual orientation. At the same time, Islam offered new opportunities for political and social advancement. Those who joined the new order could become part of a greater whole. With the spread of Islam came the Arabic language. It became the language of religion, administration, and law. But this change was not abrupt either. For generations, Arabic and Amazighan languages coexisted. Arabization was a slow process that progressed mainly in cities and along important trade routes. In the countryside and in the mountains, Amazighan languages remained alive. The religious transformation was profound. Islam not only replaced earlier belief systems, but also integrated existing traditions. Sacred places, local customs, and spiritual ideas were reinterpreted and embedded in an Islamic framework. This ability to adapt contributed significantly to the fact that Islam was able to take root in Morocco. Politically, North Africa initially became part of larger Islamic empires. The region was under the sovereignty of the Umayyad Caliphate, whose center was far to the east. However, this distance meant that local rulers and communities retained a great deal of room for maneuver. Control was indirect, and loyalty was often fragile. A key moment in Morocco's history was the increasing participation of the Amazigh in the Islamic world. They were not only subjugated, but became active actors. Amazigh warriors played an important role in the further spread of Islam, especially in the conquest of the Iberian Peninsula. This participation strengthened their self-confidence and changed the balance of power within the Islamic world. At the same time, Arab expansion led to new tensions. Social inequalities between Arab elites and non-Arab Muslims caused discontent. These tensions erupted in uprisings that shook the caliphate. In Morocco, they contributed to the region increasingly freeing itself from the direct control of the eastern centers. Culturally, Islam brought a new era, new concepts of law, and new forms of education. Mosques became centers of community life, where people not only prayed, but also taught and discussed. Religious scholars gained influence and contributed to the spread of Islamic values. Knowledge became a central component of the new order. The change also affected people's self-image. Identity was now defined more by faith than by tribal affiliation alone. This new form of community was integrative, but not free of conflict. Old loyalties did not simply disappear, but continued to exist alongside new religious ties. The result was a multi-layered society in which tradition and innovation were intertwined. In the long term, the advent of Islam laid the foundation for the emergence of independent Moroccan rulers. The region developed its own religious and political identity, which differed from the eastern centers. Islam was not only adopted, but also influenced by Moroccans. This development was to find its first state expression in the next chapter. The advent of Islam and Arab expansion thus did not mark a rupture, but a profound change. They connected Morocco more closely with the Islamic world without extinguishing its local diversity. This tension between unity and diversity gave rise to a new historical dynamic that would shape the country for centuries. The following chapter shows how the first independent Moroccan state emerged from this change, and how religion and politics became inextricably linked. Chapter 6: The Idrisides, Birth of a Moroccan State. With the end of the direct control of the great Islamic empires over the far west of North Africa in the 8th century, a political space emerged that was open to new forms of rule. In this moment of uncertainty and reorganization, a development began that was to become of decisive importance for the history of today's Morocco: the emergence of an independent state under the rule of the Idrisides. For the first time, a political entity was formed here that can be described as Moroccan not only geographically, but also culturally and religiously. The starting point of this development was a single person, Idris I. Idris was a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad and belonged to the Alid family. After political conflicts in the east of the Islamic world, he had to flee and finally reached North Africa. His arrival in the West was not a coincidence, but the result of a deliberate search for a place where new power could emerge, far away from the control of the great caliphates. When Idris I arrived in what is now northern Morocco, he encountered a region that was politically fragmented. Different Amazigh tribes controlled their respective territories, often independently of each other. Although Islam was already widespread, there was no central authority. This was exactly where the chance for Idris lay. His ancestry gave him religious legitimacy, and his role as an outsider made him an acceptable mediator for many local groups. The Araba tribe in particular recognized in Idris a figure who could bring stability. Through alliances and mutual obligations, he gained support without imposing foreign rule. This process was decisive. The new state was not created through massive conquest, but through integration, religious authority, and political wisdom. With the recognition of Idris as ruler, the history of the Idrisids began. Although their territory was initially limited, the symbolic significance was enormous. For the first time, a Muslim ruler with a local base ruled over a territory in the far west of the Islamic world. Morocco was no longer just a periphery of foreign empires, but became the center of its own power. After the assassination of Idris I, his son Idris II took over the leadership. Under him, the young state was decisively consolidated. He shifted the political focus and founded a city that was to become the heart of Moroccan history, Fez. The choice of this location was strategically wise. Fez was located on important trade routes and offered access to fertile land and water resources. Fez quickly developed from a settlement to an important city, but their importance was not only in political or economic terms. Fez became the intellectual center of the young state. Scholars, merchants, and craftsmen from different parts of the Islamic world settled here. Immigrants from Al-Andalus and present-day Tunisia in particular brought knowledge, crafts, and religious traditions with them. This mixture made Fez a place of cultural diversity. Different schools of law, theological currents, and ways of life existed side by side. The city became a laboratory of Islamic culture in the West. Mosques, educational institutions, and libraries were built and promoted the development of a religious and intellectual life that was to radiate far beyond Morocco. The Idrisids deliberately used religion as a connecting element. Islam became the basis of state legitimacy, but it was not dogmatically imposed. Rather, the rulers combined religious authority with local tradition. Amazigh customs and social structures were preserved, but were embedded in an Islamic framework. This synthesis contributed significantly to the stability of the state. Politically, however, the Idrisidian state was not a tightly organized central state. Rule was based on personal ties, loyalties, and regional alliances. This made the empire flexible, but also vulnerable. After the death of strong rulers, internal tensions and power struggles arose within the dynasty. Nevertheless, the Idridi order survived several generations. A decisive aspect of the Idrisidian era was the formation of an independent Moroccan identity. Religion, language, and political structures began to break away from the eastern centers of the Islamic world. Morocco developed its own traditions, which were part of Islam, but emphasized local peculiarities. This independence was to become an enduring feature of Moroccan history. Fez also played a central role economically. The city became a hub for trade between North Africa, the Mediterranean, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Goods, people, and ideas circulated here and contributed to the prosperity of the state. Trade not only strengthened the economy, but also cultural exchange. Despite their successes, the Idrisids were under constant pressure. Powerful neighbors and competing dynasties tried to gain influence. At the same time, internal divisions led to the weakening of central authority. But even as the Idrisids' political power waned, their legacy remained alive. Fez in particular survived the decline of the dynasty as a spiritual and cultural center. The foundations laid by the Idrisids enabled later rulers to continue this tradition. The idea of an independent Moroccan state was established, and could no longer be extinguished. The Idrisid era thus marks a turning point. A region on the edge of large empires became a political actor with its own voice. Religion, power, and culture combined to form a new order that permanently shaped Morocco. In the next chapter, a new force enters the scene that not only takes over this order, but expands it into an empire, the Almoravids, whose influence would extend far beyond Morocco. Chapter 7: Almoravids, Empire between the Sahara and Spain. In the 11th century, a new power entered the historical stage of northwest Africa that was to fundamentally change the political and religious fabric of Morocco. Coming from the vastness of the Sahara, the Almoravids combined a spirit of religious reform with military determination, creating an empire that stretched from the desert fringes of West Africa to the Iberian Peninsula. For the territory of present-day Morocco, its rise meant the transition from regional statehood to imperial power. The origins of the Almoravids do not lie in cities or palaces, but in the desert. Amazigh nomadic tribes lived there, connected to sub-Saharan Africa via caravan routes. These routes transported not only goods such as gold and salt, but also ideas and religious ideas. In this environment, a reform movement emerged that wanted to interpret Islam more strictly and uniformly. Their goal was to renew religious practice and eliminate deviations that had crept in over generations. Central to this movement was the idea of discipline, obedience, and religious purity. The Almoravids saw themselves as defenders of the right faith. Her name is often associated with those who live in the Ribat, religious fighters who combined asceticism and military action. This combination of piety and combativeness became the engine of their expansion. At the head of this movement was Yusuf ibn Tashfin, one of the most influential figures in Moroccan history. Under his leadership, the religious reform movement was transformed into a state power. Yusuf ibn Tashfin was not only a capable military strategist, but also a pragmatic ruler who understood how to integrate different groups and ensure loyalty. The Almoravids began their expansion in southern Morocco. Step by step, they brought cities, oases, and trade routes under their control. In doing so, they used both military strength and religious legitimacy. Those who submitted to their rule became part of an order that promised security, stability, and clear religious rules. For many regions, this was attractive because it brought order to politically fragmented areas. A decisive moment was the founding of Marrakech. This new capital was deliberately built in the south of the country, close to the desert and the caravan routes. Marrakech was less a traditional city than a center of power that combined military, economic, and religious functions. From here, the Almoravids directed their growing empire. With control over Morocco, the Almoravids also secured access to the rich trade networks of the Trans-Saharan region. Gold from West Africa flowed northwards and strengthened the economic base of the empire. This wealth made it possible to maintain armies, expand cities, and consolidate one's own rule. Economy and religion were closely linked. Prosperity was considered a sign of divine favor as long as it was used within the framework of religious norms. But the Almoravid Empire was not limited to North Africa. At the same time, the Iberian Peninsula was in a phase of political fragmentation. The Muslim empires there, known as the Taifa kingdoms, were under pressure from Christian expansion from the north. In this situation, some rulers turned to the Almoravids and asked for military support. The intervention of the Almoravids in Al-Andalus changed the history of the region permanently. With disciplined troops and clear leadership, they succeeded in stopping Christian advances and stabilizing Muslim areas. Soon, however, they no longer limited themselves to providing assistance. They considered the Taifa rulers morally weak and politically incompetent. Gradually, the Almoravids themselves took control of large parts of the Iberian Peninsula. This created an empire that spanned 2 continents. Morocco became the heartland of a power that united North Africa and southern Spain politically and religiously. This trans-regional rule was something new. It combined desert, coast, mountains, and European cities in a single political system. Morocco thus moved into the center of the Western Islamic world. Religiously, the Almoravids relied on a strict interpretation of Sunni Islam. They promoted religious scholars, built mosques, and ensured the enforcement of Islamic law. At the same time, they took action against practices that they considered un-Islamic. This reform claim earned them support, but also resistance, especially in regions with strong local traditions. Politically, the Almoravid Empire was highly centralized. Decisions were made by the leadership, military loyalty was crucial, and deviation was not tolerated. This strictness ensured efficiency, but also made the system susceptible to internal tensions. Especially in urban centers, Dissatisfaction with the rigid control and influence of religious authorities grew. Despite these tensions, the Almoravids had a lasting influence on Morocco. They consolidated Marrakesh as a political center, strengthened the role of Islam in the state, and permanently anchored Morocco as a power factor between Africa and Europe. Their rule showed that Morocco was not only the recipient of external influences, but could also intervene in history in a formative way. But like many empires, the Almoravid Empire was based on a delicate balance. Military expansion, religious claims, and economic control had to be constantly rebalanced. As new religious movements emerged and resistance grew, this balance began to falter. However, the decline of the Almoravids was not to mean the end of this imperial phase. Rather, he prepared the ground for an even more radical movement that further sharpened its religious and political ideas. In the next chapter, the Almohads enter the scene, and with them begins a new chapter of power, reform, and cultural flourishing. Chapter 8: Almohads, Power, Architecture, and Science. In the 12th century, a movement arose from the interior of Morocco that not only changed the political order, but also realigned thinking, art, and knowledge. The Almohads claimed to renew Islam, reform society, and create an empire that combined religious truth with political power. For the territory of today's Morocco, this marked the beginning of a golden age, the traces of which are still visible today. The rise of the Almohads was a reaction to the rule of the Almoravids. Their strict, but from the point of view of many believers, formalistic religious practice had generated dissatisfaction. In the mountains of the High Atlas, a new movement arose that advocated a more radical and at the same time philosophically grounded interpretation of faith. Its founder, Ibn Tumurt, preached the absolute unity of God and rejected any form of religious mixing. His teaching was uncompromising and openly questioned existing authorities. Ibn Tumurt's message fell on fertile ground at a time of political fatigue. Many tribes and communities joined the movement, not only out of religious conviction, but also out of a desire for renewal and justice. After Ibn Tumurt's death, Abd al-Mumin took over the leadership. He transformed the religious reform movement into a powerful political and military power. Under Abd al-Mumin, the rapid expansion of the Almohad Empire began. Morocco was united, the Almoravids were disempowered, and the new caliphate extended across North Africa to Al-Andalus. Unlike their predecessors, the Almohads saw themselves not only as rulers, but as caliphs with universal aspirations. Their power was religiously legitimized and politically centralized, a combination that gave them enormous assertiveness. Morocco became the heartland of this empire. Marrakesh remained the capital, but was given a completely new face under the Almohads. The city was expanded, fortified, and equipped with monumental buildings that made the aspirations of the new rulers visible. Architecture became a means of political communication, large, clear, monumental, and imbued with religious symbolism. One of the most famous buildings of this period is the Kutubiyya Mosque. Their minaret, visible from afar, became the model for later mosques in the Western Islamic world. The architecture of the Almohads was characterized by clear lines, harmonious proportions, and deliberate restraint in the decor. Beauty did not come about through overload, but through measure and order, a mirror of the religious ideals of the movement. But the Almohads were not limited to Marrakesh. Mosques, city walls, palaces, and bridges were built all over the empire. Cities have been reorganized, public spaces have been created, and infrastructure has been improved. Architecture was an expression of a state that was sure of its power and wanted to make this power visible. Parallel to the political and architectural development, intellectual life also flourished. The Almohads promoted education, science, and philosophy. Mosques served not only as places of prayer, but also as centers of learning. Scholars discussed theology, law, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. Knowledge was considered the way to the knowledge of God and to the order of the world. Some of the most important thinkers of the Middle Ages worked in this atmosphere. Of particular note is Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes. He combined Aristotelian philosophy with Islamic thought and shaped debates that had an impact far beyond the Islamic world. His writings influenced not only Muslim scholars, but also Christian Europe in the Middle Ages. The Almohads made such intellectual achievements possible because they showed, at least temporarily, openness to philosophical discussions. Despite their strict religious standards, they recognized the value of knowledge. This tension between dogmatic faith and intellectual freedom shaped the Almohad age and gave it its special dynamic. Economically, the empire benefited from its size and location. Trade routes connected the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Sahara, and Al-Andalus. Goods, people, and ideas circulated to an extent that had hardly been known before. Cities grew, crafts and agriculture continued to develop, and the state drew revenue from taxes and trade. But this blossoming also had its downsides. The Almohad rule was highly centralized, leaving little room for deviation. Religious unity was strictly demanded, minorities were under pressure, and dissenting opinions could be dangerous. This strictness ensured order, but also generated resistance, especially in the peripheral areas of the empire. Over time, the empire began to fail because of its own claims. The administration of such a vast empire proved difficult, internal tensions increased, and external opponents gained strength. In Al-Andalus, the pressure of Christian empires intensified, while in North Africa new movements emerged that questioned Almohad authority. Despite the later decline, the legacy of the Almohads remains exceptional. They made Morocco the center of a powerful caliphate, created monumental architecture, and promoted a cultural and scientific flourishing that had an impact far beyond their time. Their cities, buildings, and ideas shape the country to this day. The Almohad age shows what is possible when political power, economic resources, and open-mindedness come together. It was an era of great visions and great contradictions. From their rise and fall, the opportunities and limits of imperial power can be read as well as the lasting power of culture and knowledge. The next chapter will show how a phase of fragmentation begins after the collapse of this empire, and how new dynasties struggle for control of Morocco. Chapter 9: Decay and Rivalries, Merinids and Wattasids. With the decline of the Almohads in the 13th century, Morocco entered a phase marked by political uncertainty, internal power struggles, and growing external pressure. The once mighty empire disintegrated, and in its place came new dynasties vying for legitimacy, territory, and influence. For the territory of today's Morocco, an era began in which stability became the exception and competition the rule, the time of the Merinids and later the Wattasids. The Merinids came from Amazigh tribes of the east and cleverly exploited the power vacuum left by the Almohads. Initially, they appeared as military challengers, gradually bringing territories under their control. Their strength lay less in religious renewal than in military organization and political pragmatism. While the Almohads had ruled with universal claims, the Merinids concentrated primarily on securing Morocco itself. With the Merinids coming to power, the political center shifted again. Fez regained importance and became the capital of the empire. Unlike Marrakesh, which was strongly associated with the Almohads, Fez offered the Merinids a symbolic reorientation. The city was already an established religious and cultural center and was ideal for demonstrating legitimacy. The Merinids understood early on that political power alone was not enough to control a fragmented country. They invested specifically in religious and cultural institutions. In particular, the promotion of madrasas, Islamic educational institutions, became a trademark of their rule. These institutions served not only education, but also political stabilization by tying religious elites to the state. Despite these efforts, the rule of the Merinids remained fragile. The empire was marked by internal conflicts, succession crises were frequent, and rival family members fought for power. The political order was based on personal loyalties that could easily be broken. Every change of power brought with it new uncertainty. At the same time, the external pressure grew. On the Iberian Peninsula, the Muslim empires increasingly lost ground. Christian kingdoms expanded their influence and began to target the North African coast as well. Trade interests, strategic ports, and religious zeal combined to create a new threat to Morocco. The Merinids tried to respond to these challenges. They intervened several times in Al-Andalus to support Muslim areas. But these campaigns were costly and often unsuccessful. Instead of bringing new strength, they further weakened the empire. Resources were tied up, while internal stability suffered. Over time, the Merinid rule lost authority. Regional rulers gained influence, and the state could no longer assert its control over the entire territory. In this phase of decline, the Wattasids came onto the scene. Originally, they were administrators and viziers of the Merinids, but they took advantage of the weakness of their masters to take power themselves. The Wattasids did not take over a strong empire, but a politically shattered country. Their rule was defensive from the beginning. They had to hold their own against internal rivals, while fending off growing pressure from European powers. Portugal and Spain in particular began to establish bases along the Moroccan coast. This presence posed a direct challenge to the country's sovereignty. Politically, the Wattasids lacked the strong legitimacy of earlier dynasties. They could fall back on neither a religious reform movement nor a charismatic founding figure. Their power was based on administrative experience and pragmatic policies. But in times of crisis, this was often not enough to secure broad support. The economic situation further exacerbated the problems. The loss of important trade routes and coastal cities weakened the state's revenues. At the same time, trans-Saharan trade suffered from political uncertainties and new sea routes that directly connected Europe to West Africa. Morocco lost part of its traditional role as a mediator, which had a direct impact on prosperity and stability. Socially, this epoch was characterized by uncertainty. Cities had to arm themselves against attacks, rural regions suffered under changing rulers, and many people sought protection from local rulers or religious authorities. The state as a regulating force increasingly receded into the background. Despite all these difficulties, the time of the Merinids and Wattasids was not only a phase of decline. Culturally and architecturally, the Merinids in particular left significant traces. Madrasas, mosques, and urban facilities from this period still characterize the image of many Moroccan cities today. These buildings bear witness to the attempt to create order and continuity in a time of change. Politically, however, it became clear that Morocco had fallen into a crisis that could no longer be solved by traditional means. The rivalries within the country and the pressure from outside made it clear that a new form of legitimacy and leadership was needed. This crisis would eventually give rise to a dynasty that would reunite Morocco. The chapter on Merinids and Wattasids thus marks a transitional phase. It shows how fragile power can be when internal unity is lacking and external threats are growing. At the same time, this period prepared the ground for a new era in which Morocco would once again assert itself and redefine itself. In the next chapter, the Saadians enter the stage of history, with wealth, weapons, and a new claim to power that was supposed to lead Morocco out of the crisis. Chapter 10: The Saadians, Gold, Weapons, and Diplomacy. In the 16th century, Morocco entered a new era from a phase of political weakness and internal turmoil. After decades of instability, external threats, and dwindling authority, a new dynasty succeeded in reuniting the country and making it visible on the international stage: the Saadians. Their rule was characterized by wealth from trans-Saharan trade, military modernization, and skillful diplomacy between the great powers of their time. For the territory of today's Morocco, this era meant a return to strength and self-assertion. The Saadians came from the south of Morocco and derived their legitimacy from their alleged descent from the Prophet Muhammad. This religious background gave them an authority that the Wattasids increasingly lacked. At a time when the country was threatened by Portuguese and Spanish bases on the coast, the Saadians presented themselves as defenders of Islam and Moroccan independence. Their rise did not begin in the big cities of the north, but in the south, near the trade routes to the Sahara. There, they controlled access to one of the most important economic factors of their time: gold. Trans-Saharan trade connected Morocco with the empires of West Africa, from which enormous amounts of gold reached the north. This gold formed the financial basis of Saadian power. With these resources, the Saadians were able to implement something that their predecessors had hardly succeeded: a modern, well-equipped army. They made targeted investments in firearms, especially muskets and artillery, which they obtained from Europe. While many Islamic empires were still reluctant to fully adopt new military technologies, the Saadians recognized their importance early on. Military strength became the core of their rule. Politically, the Saadians succeeded in ousting the Wattasids and taking control of Morocco. Marrakesh once again became the capital and the center of power. From here they ruled an empire that was more stable and cohesive than in the decades before. The relocation of the center of power to Marrakesh was also a symbolic act. It tied in with earlier imperial traditions. But the Saadians were not only warriors, but also diplomats. They ruled at a time when Europe was in a state of upheaval. Spain and Portugal were maritime powers. The Ottoman Empire expanded its influence in the Mediterranean, and new global trade networks emerged. Morocco was strategically located between these powers, and had to navigate skillfully to preserve its independence. The Saadians played these forces off against each other. They maintained diplomatic relations with European royal houses, traded weapons and goods, and formed temporary alliances. At the same time, they kept their distance from the Ottoman Empire, which was trying to extend its influence to Morocco as well. This balancing policy was risky, but successful. Morocco remained one of the few countries in North Africa that never came under Ottoman rule permanently. The pinnacle of Saadian power is inextricably linked to one of the most famous events in Moroccan history: the Battle of the Three Kings. This battle took place near the Atlantic coast in 1578 and had far-reaching consequences for Morocco, Portugal, and Europe as a whole. In this confrontation, three rulers met: the Moroccan Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur, the Portuguese King Sebastian, and a rival Moroccan pretender to the throne. The conflict arose from a mixture of internal power struggles and Portuguese expansion plans. Portugal wanted to expand its influence in North Africa, a project that was to prove fatal. The battle ended in a crushing defeat for Portugal. All three kings were killed, which gave the event its name. For Morocco, the victory was of enormous importance. He secured the country's independence, permanently weakened Portugal, and gave the Saadians international prestige. From then on, Europe recognized Morocco as a serious power. After this triumph, Saadian rule reached its climax. Ahmad al-Mansur, also known as the Golden One, used the prestige gain to further expand his power. The epithet was not chosen by chance. Under his rule, gold flowed to Morocco on an unprecedented scale. Palaces, mosques, and representative buildings were built, demonstrating the wealth of the state. A particularly impressive testimony to this period is the El Badi Palace in Marrakesh. It was intended less as a residence and more as a manifestation of power, wealth, and cultural greatness. Architecture once again became a political symbol, similar to the time of the Almohads, but with a stronger focus on luxury and representation. Culturally, Morocco experienced a renewed flourishing under the Saadians. Scholars, artists, and craftsmen were encouraged, and Marrakesh developed into an important cultural center. At the same time, the state remained strongly militarily influenced. Order and control were central elements of rule, especially in the peripheral areas of the empire. But despite all their successes, the Saadians were already carrying the seeds of their decline. The immense concentration of power and wealth led to intradynastic rivalries. After the death of Ahmad al-Mansur, fierce power struggles broke out between his sons. These conflicts weakened the state and undermined the stability that had been painstakingly built. In addition, the world around Morocco continued to change. European powers expanded their naval power, new trade routes made trans-Saharan trade less central, and economic foundations shifted. The wealth that had carried the Saadians began to dry up. The Saadian era was nevertheless a turning point. It showed that Morocco was capable of modernizing militarily, asserting itself diplomatically, and benefiting economically. The victory in the Battle of the Three Kings became a symbol of Moroccan self-assertion and national memory. With the decline of the Saadians, however, a phase of relative stability ended again. The country was soon to enter a time of internal uncertainty again, until a new dynasty entered the stage that was to shape Morocco to the present day. The next chapter begins the story of the Alaouites, whose rule continues to this day. Chapter 11: The Alaouites, the dynasty to the present. With the decline of the Saadians in the early 17th century, Morocco once again entered a period of political uncertainty. Power struggles, regional uprisings, and the growing influence of foreign powers weakened the country. But out of this instability emerged a new dynasty that managed not only to unite Morocco, but to shape it for centuries, right up to the present day. The rise of the Alaouites marks the beginning of the longest and most enduring rule in the history of present-day Morocco. The Alaouites trace their ancestry back to the Prophet Muhammad. This genealogical connection gave them a strong religious legitimacy from the very beginning. In a society where religious authority was closely linked to political power, this was a decisive advantage. Unlike many earlier dynasties, the Alaouites did not act as a radical reform movement, but as mediators between tradition, religion, and political order. Its origin lies in the southeast of Morocco, in the Tafilalet region. This area was strategically important because it was located on important trade routes that connected North Africa to the Sahara. Early on, the Alaouites succeeded in binding local tribes to themselves and gradually expanding their position. In doing so, they benefited from the longing of many people for stability after decades of chaos. The actual founder of the Alaouite power was Moulay Rashid. In the second half of the 17th century, he managed to defeat rival forces and reunite Morocco. He relied on military strength, but also on political integration. Regional elites were involved, religious authorities were supported, and local traditions were respected. This balance between assertiveness and pragmatism became a trademark of the Alaouites. Under his successor Moulay Ismail, the dynasty reached its first great heyday. Moulay Ismail ruled for more than 50 years and is considered one of Morocco's most powerful rulers. His rule was characterized by hard centralization and the attempt to secure the power of the state in the long term. He created a powerful army that reported directly to the Sultan and broke the influence of rival tribes. Moulay Ismail made Meknes his capital and had monumental buildings built there. Palaces, city walls, and mosques were intended to demonstrate the strength of the dynasty. At the same time, he led a strict regulatory policy that brought stability, but was also associated with harshness. His rule clearly showed that the Alaouites were willing to wield power consistently to enforce unity. After Moulay Ismail's death, the empire was again in turmoil. Succession crises and internal conflicts shook the state. But unlike earlier dynasties, Alaoui rule did not collapse. Their religious legitimacy, their regional roots, and their ability to adapt enabled them to survive crises. The dynasty proved to be resilient. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the Alaouites faced new challenges. Europe increasingly emerged as the dominant power. Trade, diplomacy, and military pressure from Spain, France, and Great Britain influenced Moroccan politics. The sultans tried to preserve the country's independence by vacillating between the European powers and carefully introducing reforms. At the same time, Morocco's internal structure remained complex. The Sultan did not rule over a completely centralized state, but over a mosaic of regions, tribes, and cities. Loyalty had to be renegotiated again and again. The Alaouites ruled less through permanent control than through symbolic authority, religious legitimation, and a deliberate demonstration of power. In the 19th century, external pressure increased considerably. Military defeats, economic dependencies, and political interventions weakened the state's freedom of action. Nevertheless, the dynasty remained in power. Even when Morocco came under French and Spanish protectorate at the beginning of the 20th century, the Sultan formally remained head of state. This continuity would later prove decisive. The role of the Alaouites during the colonial period was ambivalent. On the one hand, they were severely limited in their power, and on the other hand, they became a symbol of national unity. Many Moroccans saw the Sultan as an embodiment of their own identity that went beyond colonial borders. This symbolic meaning strengthened the position of the dynasty in the long term. After Morocco's independence in 1956, the Alaouite monarchy entered a new phase. The Sultan became king, and the dynasty adapted to the requirements of a modern nation-state. The monarchy remained a central component of the political system, but gradually opened up to reforms. Under Hassan II, the monarchy was highly centralized. His reign was marked by political control, but also by institutional building. After his death, his son Muhammad VI initiated cautious reforms. Social opening, economic modernization, and a new role for the monarchy characterized this phase. Today, the Alaouites are one of the oldest dynasties still ruling in the world. Its history is closely linked to the history of Morocco itself. They survived empires, colonialism, and political upheavals by constantly repositioning themselves. Their power is based less on absolute control than on symbolic authority, religious legitimacy, and historical continuity. The Alaouite dynasty thus stands for stability in a country that has experienced change again and again. It embodies the connection between past and present, between tradition and adaptation. Without them, the history of Morocco cannot be understood, and their role will remain a central factor in Moroccan identity in the future. The next chapter focuses on Europe's direct intervention in Moroccan sovereignty, a phase in which external powers played a decisive role in determining the fate of the country. Chapter 12: Europe intervenes, colonial pressure and treaties. The road to the French and Spanish protectorates. In the 19th century, the forces that increasingly threatened Morocco's independence intensified. While Europe concentrated industrial, military, and maritime power, the kingdom of today's Morocco came under increasing pressure. What initially began as a diplomatic struggle for trade privileges gradually developed into political influence and finally led to formal foreign rule. The road to the French and Spanish protectorates was not a sudden break, but the result of decades of treaties, interventions, and forced reforms. Morocco's strategic location made the country particularly desirable for European powers. Located on the threshold between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, it controlled important sea routes and was also the gateway to Africa. For trading nations, Moroccan ports offered access to markets, raw materials, and zones of influence. At the same time, Morocco was considered one of the last independent areas in North Africa, a circumstance that was increasingly perceived as an anomaly in a time of imperial expansion. Internally, the Alaouite monarchy faced enormous challenges. The state was decentralized, control over the territory varied regionally, and finances were strained. Militarily, Morocco could not keep pace with the modern European armies. Attempts to introduce reforms often remained half-hearted or met with resistance. European powers deliberately exploited these structural weaknesses. The colonial pressure initially manifested itself economically. Trade treaties granted European merchants special rights, customs concessions, and legal privileges. Consular jurisdiction removed foreigners from Moroccan jurisdiction. Step by step, the state lost sovereignty over central areas of its economy. At the same time, the sultans borrowed from European banks to finance reforms, the military and the court, a dependency that resulted in political influence. Military defeats accelerated this development. Clashes with European powers revealed the inferiority of the Moroccan armed forces and undermined the state's negotiating position. Each defeat led to new concessions, reparations, and treaties that further restricted the room for maneuver. Europe increasingly argued that Morocco was incapable of maintaining order and security, a common colonial narrative used to justify interventions. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the competition between the powers intensified. France regarded Morocco as a natural complementary area to its North African possessions, especially Algeria. Spain, in turn, claimed zones of influence in the north and south of the country, based on historical presence and coastal bases. Other powers also got involved. but France and Spain prevailed in the long term. International diplomacy played a decisive role. Morocco's future was negotiated in European capitals, often without Moroccan participation. Conferences, agreements, and secret additional protocols regulated zones of influence, economic rights, and political responsibilities. Morocco became the object of great power politics, not the subject of its own decisions. At the same time, the internal situation deteriorated. Uprisings, regional autonomy efforts, and social tensions increased. The state reacted with reform attempts, which were often under European supervision. Administrative and financial reforms were intended to bring efficiency, but at the same time served to enforce foreign interests. The presence of European advisors and military missions became the norm. The decisive turning point came in 1912 with the Treaty of Fez. Under massive pressure, the Sultan signed an agreement that effectively deprived Morocco of its sovereignty. France gained control over administration, military, and foreign policy. The Sultan formally remained in office, but was severely limited in his powers. At the same time, Spain established its own protectorate zones, especially in the north and south. The logic of the protectorate was based on a double structure. Externally, Morocco remained a kingdom with its own monarchy. Internally, the colonial powers determined the central decisions. This construction was intended to dampen resistance and maintain the appearance of continuity. In practice, it meant a profound transformation of state and society. The colonial administration introduced new institutions, laws, and infrastructures. Roads, railways, and ports were expanded, primarily to serve economic interests and secure military control. Agriculture and mining were geared towards exports. At the same time, social hierarchies emerged in which Europeans were privileged and the local population remained disadvantaged. The colonial intervention also changed the political self-image. While the monarchy retained its symbolic role, awareness of foreign rule grew in the country. Intellectuals, merchants, and religious authorities began to criticize the colonial order. The first national networks were formed, at first cautiously, later more openly. The protectorate status thus inadvertently created the conditions for a modern independence movement. Spanish and French rule differed in style and intensity, but both pursued the goal of control. Spain focused on limited zones and military presence. France relied on comprehensive administration and economic penetration. For Morocco, this meant a fragmented colonial experience that deepened regional differences and created new tensions. In the long term, the protectorate was a paradox. On the one hand, it brought modernization spurts. On the other hand, it destroyed political self-determination. The Alaouite monarchy survived, not despite, but also because of its role as a mediator between colonial power and society. This continuity should be crucial after independence. The path to the protectorate was therefore not an inevitable fate, but the result of concrete decisions, power relations, and international interests. Morocco became the scene of European rivalries and paid the price for its strategic location. But the story did not end with foreign rule. The colonial intervention gave rise to resistance, organization, and finally the claim to self-determination. The next chapter focuses on life under colonial rule, on adaptation and resistance, on reforms and repression, and on the forces that paved the way to independence. Chapter 13: Life under Colonial Rule. Resistance, Reforms, and National Identity. The establishment of the French and Spanish protectorates in 1912 marked the beginning of an era of profound upheaval for today's Morocco. Colonial rule meant not only political heteronomy, but also a comprehensive intervention in the everyday life, economy, society, and self-image of the population. This period was marked by adaptation and coercion, by reforms and repression, and by the gradual formation of a modern national identity. The colonial state presented itself as a force for order. The administration, judiciary, and military were reorganized and were under European control. Externally, the monarchy remained, but real decision-making power lay with the colonial authorities. This dual structure shaped everyday life, Traditional institutions continued to exist, but were governed by an overarching system that set different priorities. Economically, the colonial powers pursued clear goals. Infrastructure projects, roads, railways, ports, have been massively expanded to develop raw materials and facilitate exports. Agricultural land was converted to market-oriented production, especially where European settlers invested. These changes created growth, but also inequality, land concentration, displacement of local producers, and dependence on world markets hit many rural communities hard. In the cities, the social fabric changed. European neighborhoods emerged with modern architecture, administration, and services, often spatially separated from traditional neighborhoods. This separation was both visible and symbolic. It reflected a hierarchy in which colonized and colonizers were unequal. Education, healthcare, and employment opportunities followed this order. At the same time, the colonial powers introduced reforms that had long-term effects. Modern schools, new administrative practices, and technical training opportunities opened up new perspectives for a small, growing elite. These reforms were ambivalent. They served to control more efficiently, but also provided access to knowledge that was later used to criticize colonial rule. Everyday life under colonial rule was therefore marked by contradictions. Many people adapted, sought advantages in the new system, or tried to combine traditional ways of life with the new requirements. Others experienced the changes as a threat to their existence. These tensions repeatedly erupted into resistance. The resistance took different forms. In rural areas, armed uprisings against the colonial power occurred, especially where encroachment on land ownership and local autonomy was strongest. These movements were often regionally limited and were crushed militarily, but left behind an enduring symbol of resistance to foreign rule. At the same time, a political intellectual resistance developed in the cities. Educated elites, traders, scholars, and civil servants began to question the colonial order. Newspapers, associations, and discussion circles became places of exchange. Demands for reforms, rights, and codetermination gained weight. The resistance increasingly shifted from armed actions to political organization. The monarchy played a central role in this. The Sultan formally remained head of state and was perceived by many as a symbol of continuity. In a society that valued religious and historical legitimacy, the monarchy offered a point of reference that went beyond regional and social differences. This symbolic role proved crucial to the formation of a national consciousness. The Second World War marked a turning point. Global upheavals weakened the colonial powers and changed the international order. Anti-colonial movements gained strength worldwide, and hopes for self-determination also grew in Morocco. At the same time, the war brought new burdens, economic bottlenecks, and political uncertainty. In this phase, national movements with clear goals were formed. They combined demands for independence with social and political reforms. The discourse shifted from isolated protests to a comprehensive project of national renewal. The idea of a Moroccan nation took shape, not as a recourse to a distant past, but as a vision of a common future. The colonial powers reacted contradictory. On the one hand, they tried to maintain control through limited reforms and concessions. On the other hand, they rely on repression when demands go too far. Arrests, censorship, and political bans were the order of the day. However, these measures often strengthened the resistance instead of breaking it. Culturally, the colonial period played a central role in the formation of national identity. Language, religion, and history were reinterpreted and politicized. Traditions that had previously been local or religious were given national significance. Education and the media helped to develop a common narrative that summed up the country's diversity in an overarching identity. Social issues also came more into focus. Inequality, land issues, and working conditions became part of the political agenda. National movements linked the fight against foreign rule with the claim to social justice. This connection made the resistance broader and more deeply anchored. At the end of the colonial era, there was a country that had changed. Morocco was more urbanized, economically integrated into global structures, and more politically conscious than ever before. The colonial experience had left wounds, but also brought forth new skills: organization, political language, and international networking. The national identity that emerged during this period was the result of conflict and negotiation. It united tradition and modernity, monarchy and reform, religion and politics. This identity formed the basis for the next decisive step, the transition from foreign rule to independence. The next chapter will focus on this transition, the path to state sovereignty, the role of the monarchy, and the challenges of a new beginning in an independent Morocco. Chapter 14: Independence and the Era of Modern Kings. From the fight for freedom to the reign of Mohammed VI. The middle of the 20th century marked a historical turning point for today's Morocco. After decades of colonial foreign rule, resistance, political organization, and international pressure condensed into a dynamic that ultimately led to independence. However, the attainment of sovereignty did not mark the beginning of history, but the beginning of a new challenge: the construction of a modern state that had to combine tradition and change. During this phase, the monarchy moved to the center of the political order and shaped Morocco's path to the present day. The fight for freedom was not a single act, but a multi-layered process. Political parties, trade unions, religious authorities, and civil society networks worked together. Protests, strikes, and diplomatic initiatives intensified after the Second World War. The international situation favored the demands for self-determination, and the colonial powers were increasingly under pressure to justify themselves. In Morocco, the idea of national unity gained strength, supported by a broad social base. The monarchy played a key role. Sultan Mohammed V became a symbolic figure of the national resistance. His refusal to accept colonial requirements unconditionally gave the movement moral authority. When the colonial power tried to break this symbolic power, the conflict intensified. With the opposite effect, support for the Sultan grew and resistance gained unity. The independence that was achieved in 1956 was the result of this interplay of internal pressure and external reorganization. With it, the monarch returned to a new role, from symbol of resistance to head of state of a sovereign country. The challenges were enormous. Administration, economy, and security had to be reorganized, colonial structures dismantled, and social expectations met. The state was faced with the task of forming unity out of diversity. In the first years after independence, the development of state institutions dominated. The monarchy established itself as the central axis of the political system. Parties played an important role, but the balance between monarchical authority and political participation remained controversial. Questions of the distribution of power, the constitution, and the role of the military determined the political agenda. After the death of Mohammed V, Hassan II took over the leadership. His long reign had a lasting impact on Morocco. Hassan II relied on a strong centralized monarchy and knew how to create institutions that would ensure stability. At the same time, his rule was marked by tensions. Political opposition, social inequality, and regional conflicts posed lasting challenges for the state. In this phase, the monarchy became a regulating force, but also an object of criticism. Political control, restrictions on freedom of expression, and harsh measures against members of the opposition marked certain years. At the same time, the state invested in infrastructure, education, and international relations. Morocco positioned itself as a reliable partner in the international system and sought economic opening. A central theme of this time was national integration. The claim to secure territorial unity shaped political decisions and influenced the self-image of the state. National symbols, history, and monarchy have been deliberately strengthened to promote cohesion. This policy brought stability, but also demanded compromises and generated controversy. At the end of the 20th century, a new change became apparent. Social expectations changed, and a younger generation demanded reforms, transparency, and social participation. The death of Hassan II marked the transition to a new phase. His son Mohammed VI succeeded him and combined continuity with cautious renewal. Under Muhammad VI, a phase of gradual reforms began. Social opening, economic modernization, and institutional adjustments were in the foreground. The king positioned himself as a promoter of development, poverty reduction, and cultural diversity. At the same time, the monarchy remained the center of the political system, not as a pure ceremonial power, but as an active actor. This era was characterized by the search for balance. On the one hand, traditions and the historical role of the monarchy should be preserved. On the other hand, globalization, urbanization, and digital networking require new answers. Reforms in administration, the judiciary, and the economy are aimed at increasing efficiency and expanding social participation without jeopardizing stability. Internationally, Morocco has distinguished itself as a regional player with a wide range of partnerships. Economic cooperation, diplomatic initiatives, and cultural exchange strengthened the international presence. At the same time, inner change remained a process that required negotiation. Progress and setbacks were often close together. The era of modern kings shows Morocco as a country in transition, from colonial dependence to state sovereignty, from traditional rule to modern governance. The monarchy functioned as a constant entity that enabled and limited change at the same time. Their ability to adapt contributed significantly to ensuring political continuity. Today, independence is not only seen as a historic success, but as an ongoing mission. The questions of social justice, political participation, and economic development are part of an open process. History since 1956 shows that independence is not an endpoint, but the beginning of a new responsibility. The reign of Muhammad VI closes the arc of this chapter, from liberation to the establishment of state order to the search for a contemporary model of monarchy and society. Morocco's path was neither linear nor free of conflict, but it was characterized by the ability to relate tradition and modernity. In the next chapter, the focus is on Morocco in the present, on a country between millennial-old culture and global future, whose history continues to be written. Chapter 15, Morocco Today, Tradition, Change, and Future. Between millennial-old culture and modern globalization. At the beginning of the 21st century, Morocco is at a point marked by tensions, opportunities, and contradictions at the same time. Hardly any other country so visibly combines millennial-old cultural depth with the requirements of a globalized present. Today, Morocco is neither exclusively traditional nor completely modern. It is a country in a permanent negotiation process between preservation and renewal. History is omnipresent in Morocco. It is not only evident in monuments, medines, or rituals, but also in ways of thinking, social structures, and political symbols. Tradition is not a static legacy, but a living part of everyday life. Religious festivals, family ties, local customs, and handicraft techniques continue to shape the lives of many people. At the same time, Morocco is deeply involved in global networks, economically, culturally, and politically. The monarchy plays a central role in this area of tension. Under the leadership of Muhammad VI, the state sees itself as modernization-oriented without abandoning the historical foundations of rule. The monarchy acts as a stabilizing framework that allows for reforms, but also limits them. It is a political actor, religious authority, and national symbol at the same time, a combination that distinguishes Morocco from many other countries. Morocco has changed a lot socially in recent decades. Urbanization, education, and technological development have created new realities of life. Large cities are growing rapidly, rural regions are changing, and a young population is asking new questions of the state and society. Topics such as social justice, work, education, and co-determination are at the center of public debates. The demographic factor is particularly formative. A large part of the population is young, well-connected, and increasingly globally oriented. Digital media provide access to information, opinions, and lifestyles beyond national borders. Of course, this generation moves between tradition and modernity, often with a claim to combine the two without having to commit themselves. Economically, Morocco is pursuing a strategy of opening up and diversification. Industry, renewable energies, agriculture, and tourism are important pillars. International investment and trade agreements have linked the country more closely to Europe, Africa, and the global market. At the same time, structural challenges remain. Regional inequalities, unemployment, and social disparities remain present. Tourism is a particularly visible example of the ambivalence of change. Historic cities, landscapes, and cultural diversity attract people from all over the world. At the same time, this development raises questions about sustainability, cultural authenticity, and social participation. Morocco is faced with the task of preserving its cultural heritage without reducing it to mere consumer objects. Culturally, today's Morocco presents itself as a plural space. Amazigh identity, Arab Islamic traditions, and modern forms of expression coexist. Language, music, fashion, and art reflect this diversity. The official recognition of cultural polyphony is a sign of change. At the same time, its implementation in everyday life remains an ongoing challenge. Politically, Morocco is moving in a controlled reform process. Institutional adjustments, legal reforms, and new forms of participation were introduced without fundamentally changing the power structure. This gradual development aims at stability and avoidance of fractures. Critics criticize the pace and scope of the reforms, while supporters point to the importance of continuity. Internationally, Morocco is positioning itself as a bridge between regions. Its relations with Europe, its role in Africa, and its partnerships in the Mediterranean make the country a major player. Diplomacy, business, and cultural exchange are central instruments of this foreign policy. Morocco deliberately uses its historical and geographical location as an advantage. At the same time, global networking is associated with new dependencies. Economic fluctuations, geopolitical tensions, and environmental challenges have a direct impact on the country. Climate change, water scarcity, and environmental issues are no longer abstract issues, but concrete questions for the future. The answer to this question requires long-term strategies and social consensus. Domestically, the question of social cohesion remains central. There are tensions between urban and rural, rich and poor, tradition and modernity, which must be moderated politically and socially. Education plays a key role in this. It is the link between the past and the future, and decides how well the country is prepared for future challenges. Morocco today is not a finished project, but a process. Its strength lies in its ability to integrate change without losing its own identity. History shows that the country has always absorbed new influences and transformed them into something of its own. This historical experience is an important resource for the future. Morocco's future will depend on how well it succeeds in understanding tradition not as an obstacle but as a foundation, and modernization not as a rupture, but as a further development. There is no contradiction between millennia-old culture and modern globalization, but a field of tension that requires design. This closes the circle of this historic journey. From the first humans to empires, dynasties, colonial rule, and independence to the present day, Morocco is a country of transitions. His story is not finished. It continues every day, in the everyday lives of his people and in the decisions that shape his future.